Hello everyone, today we talk about holy and just war, about the first, the second Crusade time, at least between the 11th to 12th century. You know that we have scoped already an important amount of aspects, at least of the traditional meaning of holy war especially. And what I've gotten interested in as a medievalist and as a military historian, also fascinated with the history of religions, as is how, say, contemporary historiography, the one you can get the information from more easily, etc., today seems to be treating the crusading warfare, the crusades, the theological premises, foundations, and theory, etc., in a very secular, modern fashion that gives me the distinct impression that fundamentally sometimes probably the specialists on crusade, the crusading era, even the leading scholars, do not fundamentally get anymore. They've never gotten in their generation, maybe even from their teachers at this point, probably the sense of this whole thing, right? And I have fun a little bit. We all have some of that. At least I have fun doing this because I basically don't really force myself into making these videos every day, but choosing them randomly sometimes I would prefer else. As you know, I don't specialize in the crusading era and crusading warfare just per se, but thanks to Schwerpunkt I had the opportunity to, and I've gotten particularly curious of this aspect, as I think that even as a layman, at least relatively to the field of specialization, I can I can sense something more easily than what this great bubble of some kind of abstraction and distraction we have gotten to this point of historiography allows, generally speaking, the scholars, consequently also the public, to properly get, right? So I make these videos in which I criticize probably the method in which these topics are delivered, with some interesting note that we will see now. So these are just bits of considerations about, again, holy and just war, rolling around the entire crusading era, and it's also more kind of lay implications for the concept of fact of just war regulating Christian society in these centuries and so on, right? So one aspect that at least is self-evident, that is gotten properly about the Crusades, is that these were essentially integrating the traditional chivalric and warlike lifestyle into the struggle to save one's soul. Now, just on this statement, you can dissect an entire, say, section of historiography and wondering whether it is gotten correctly or not, because the concept in itself is very obvious, right? And everybody's basically going to accept that. Now, the most important aspect, however, the Crusades and how they were revived, at least how they were by a degree invented, at least in the way we have been presented as such, right? What the story that we've been told is that from the 11th century, at some point, the popes invented the thing, and Western Christians went at war in the Near East and in the Baltic, in southern Spain, etc., and they began to do something that had never appeared before, right? There are many adults, again, even conservatives, that actually believe that this was a moment of obscurantism, of some kind of weird stagnation. There are many reasons why people still believe like that. But fundamentally, they attribute this decision to a sort of, again, weird, mad, crazy, violent innovation that had come about because, religion is bad, because it's, we don't even know why, but it must be so, right? Because they call the Crusades are bad, right? So today I'm not even going to discuss this because, as you know, I've talked plenty of this. Sometimes I manage to make everybody mad about this because I criticize, for example, the necessity, at least, of stressing the concept of religiosity connected to Crusades as a war, because it's every war at the time was religious, right? You don't need to specify that. If you need to specify that, what you're doing is basically blaming religion, right? Because the only way I've heard this being done, by the way, is saying, okay, so it's bad because it's war, right? So there may have been no reason to make war, there is no reason to make war whatsoever in the first place. Humans shouldn't do it. It's bad. Whoever does it, it's somehow, just bad because he does war, because he uses the military instrument without looking at any political context. And so most of this gets down to a sort of radical moral subjectivism, where basically you're actually fueling a war from one side and blaming the others because they're kind of even just responding to the war, militarily speaking, and so pretending that you're acting as a humane person, and of course not even knowing that humane actually means dirty, because that's what the etymology of human really is in Latin. And again, you missed the entire point why not just crusades were fought, but also why war is fought, generally speaking, in a broader anthropological sense. Even if you want to keep kind of the spiritual dimension out of the equation, it's exactly the same thing. Because even if you were a materialist, you would have to. There is an extra step perhaps you would miss regarding spiritual forces, but what eventually spiritual forces do is also influencing matter such. So you're basically describing the same dynamics. It's really laziness and somehow narrow-mindedness and incapacity to properly frame information in a broader system. But so it goes, and that's how I guess mostly crusades are framed, right? There are those kind of SJWs, leftistic, woke, whatever, people out there making points like, look, the Christians were bad because they did crusades. Well, what about the Muslims that invaded, Christian lands since the beginning of their history? And how should they reacted? It sounds a little bit like, that damn Zelensky is going on with the war because, he can't surrender. Nothing will happen to Ukraine, of course. Nobody will die, nobody will be genocide and process. No, it must be that evil bastard that, decided even to launch a counteroffensive because, he's a sick maniac that wants to send his people to the Holocaust, basically. And that's literally the same kind of mentality. Of course, that's why I repeat constantly that any post-traditional ideology is the same. Nationalism is just a flattening of individual value to a low, like the average of a piece of dirt called country, that is disgustingly low in any country in the world, even the top ones, as average. And then communism is the next step, and let's not even talk about that. But that's what we have gotten to, because the entire concept that there is a moral responsibility or a spirituality or even just a scientificity in the study of war has practically gone out of the window by this point for the masses. But we don't talk for the masses. That's also probably why my channel is still so contained, right? But the question is actually much more important, and it gets properly, at least in the examples we treated, properly understanding concepts of attack and defense, political aim, what is the purpose of war, what is war in the first place. And you can read whatever, but if you're not able to answer didactically these questions, you cannot understand any of that, right? And again, most adults go on just with that, and they can flip whatever they want, because that's what the modern world has told you can do. It's flipping whatever you want, however you like, right? This means that you have no power, so you will be the average fourth estater without any value. You will sink anyway. You may even live with rights on paper, but these rights will evaporate in practice. That's the reason why people are getting poorer, right? It's not, again, the fault of the terrible, people at the top that are plotting against our freedom. It's as if freedom was even a value, right? By itself, it isn't, right? Liberty is a value, to say the least. In fact, the entire concept of sacrifice, right? Of a divine bond, of a spiritual mission, is completely removed from the equation, because no duty is required in the first place, but to anyone anymore. At the time of the Crusades, these concepts properly did not exist. Right, the world was not in the condition to afford such mental degeneration. Right, they had already undergone that by a degree since the fall and gradually, but nobody would alienate himself because life was just so omnipervasive and omnipresent in the most violent and dramatic and serious issues that people would have made those points would have sound even more stupid than today's ones, and nobody properly. At least there were some that did that, and surprisingly enough, there were heretics with communistic, some kind of, even kind of vegan, properly study Catholicism, because you will find out within that, and also the fight against property and against the elite and the hierarchy, something that reveals to you from which side, in this case, the non-civilization stands. What the emarginated are literally doomed to, fortunately, their destruction for the reinvigoration of civilization through their blood. They always lose. There is not a single moment in history in which the people ever achieved anything per se, right? It was always an elite, a group of that, a section of that, an aristocracy that made the thing and managed to profit from that, and the others were mostly on the wake of that accomplishment. And then when, of course, the moment of expansion ended, they began to blame the system because they realized they had never been up to that, right? And the 11th century, very often when we talk about the 11th to 12th century, about the latter, there's probably also this idea of the 12th century Renaissance, right? And so we tend to attribute the revival of the year 1000, whatever, kind of a positive picture to the world. Yet at the time, if you study the sources, the general tempers, etc., people were deeply agitated. People were deeply concerned. But it's kind of an idea. In fact, we have also of the Renaissance later on, in the early modern age, as a moment of prosperity, of opening, of ideas, of individual liberties, whatever. It was a disastrous moment. People were freaking out for things like the Reformation. But in comparison, of course, the religious things were much more important than, say, the discovery of the Americas, just per se. And yet we have been told, again, the opposite of this all. Right? Not that these centuries were not objectively ones of growth, but they had come, first of all, after moments of crisis, and there was nothing that would simply grant that things would keep going the right way. In the moment of the expansion, as we have been witnessing also during the 20th century, it was also the problem of regulation. Right? Certain things, like the system was enlarging to the point that people didn't know how to handle that. This idea of the channeling into the Crusades of the most violent and kind of unruly elements of Western Christendom that towards against the infidels was one of at least the motivation, or the ways at least this phenomenon was fueled and disciplined and kind of and employed proper. Right, so there was a moment of deep spiritual tension and of struggle, right? There is not a magical elevation of moral forces out of nothing. Moral forces mostly emerge from struggles, from moments of crisis, and so something that when you make it to the other side looks like great, but at the same time is also the beginning of some kind of other problems, as we will see now, that are instead the opposite, the softening up again. And so saving one's soul was the concern, as we have seen, of all especially the warriors that had been living up to that point. Now, the warrior had become already something different, was more of a soldier, and the Crusades showed that pretty well, because you don't really make such an orderly and successful, especially expedition from Belgium to Palestine in such an orderly fashion if you don't have an advanced military culture, an order, a discipline, whatever. So these things had naturally been maturing during the High Middle Ages in the heart of Europe. and a bit all the world was reawakening. However, the West seemed to be better equipped and having an extra gear in the process, which, given the massive expansion, the inversion of the trade balance, and essentially in a couple of centuries, the overrunning of Constantinople and more, right? The successful conversion of the northeasterners and beyond, really you can appreciate to a substantial degree, right? The problem with saving one's soul in a kind of warlike way, here we can call it chivalric, and they are basically the same thing, because again, our understanding of the term chivalric is mostly, again, the one that has been attributed ex post in the moment in which had already become an hypothesis of itself, exactly at the lock of medieval knighthood in, say, the third quarter of the 12th century, where mostly a certification and a crystallization system was put in place. By the 11th century, knighthood was accessible and unregulated. Thus, there were many more milites. The equipment cost less, right? It was still a pretty narrow elite if you consider the rest of the population was overwhelmingly, peasants, and just also an equally few clergy, right? And basically all got down to that. I mean, the political establishment were the milites, right? And the concern of these men invested of the cingulum militaris, and so this faculty essentially of bearing arms, and so the imperium, and so a degree of nobility. It is a bit also at the base of, the investiture controversy, the idea of how this should be regulated morally. Should the emperor have an unmitigated earthly power? And, there shouldn't be an opposition that counters. These are actually Jungian ideas, right? You can argue that the West improved dramatically in a civilizational sense because it always had a florid, division of universal powers, earthly and spiritual, even competing with each other, right? Other systems sclerotized. The Muslims technically didn't have a clergy. The Byzantines had a Caesaropapism, right? So the risk of civilizational sclerotization is very high all the time, because cultural resistances are hard sometimes, even especially in the most successful cases, to adapt to other ones. And there are many reasons, naturally, why the West had come to this point. But let's say, coming back to the concept of the of salvation, right? The militaries fundamentally believed in the fact that their heroic deeds in life were essentially a mean to come closer to God and possibly to save themselves. Naturally, Christianity had told that this cannot quite easily be done. Actually, it had not added anything to the entire concept, where it was not easier at this point by Christian standards to save oneself, because, as you know, that technically is not possible, right? But that was exactly the same in paganism, to the degree in which at least you had to enter a sort of cosmic syntony with God, and in a sense becoming God yourself, reunited to the One, to the Father, to this virile, rational principle that ordered the entire universe. And naturally this has a deep martial character just by itself. There were all some cults and practice that remained also in the idea of the angel-like woman in chivalric literature, etc. That was the great mother of the Pelasgian war that needed to be tamed and dominated and transfigured in victory through the self-sacrifice in the holy war. So all these ideas were present in all mythologies, in all folklore, and were technically known to anyone, at least to the degree the church was aware of that, and actually not even contrary to it, because the Crusades definitely weren't born in 1096. They had already been there, and the entire deal of the empire, the necessity of a priesthood in the first place, revolved exactly around this, right? There was a huge awareness on the civilizational effort that empires, earthly powers in the first place, had to carry out in order to allow the salvation of humanity, right? It's a collective deal because you cannot save yourself technically without saving the world entire. So Christianity had essentially told that God had offered humans at this dramatic example of his own son's sacrifice, that is the Son of God as much as the Son of Man, in the Bible, and that thus can show that even the most humble, right, let's say, living outcome can't contain itself spiritually the capacity to transfigure the world entire. So it's a message of hope, in fact. This pes, the properly and also connected to the fetus, and so to the idea that doesn't matter how powerful you are in terms of as a earthly ruler, etc. There is always a if you want a simpler and more effective way that, however, is also dramatically more difficult to achieve, in order to just carry out all this. And this cannot be done without God's grace. And again, I made a video actually about grace exactly also as far as paganism was concerned. At least in any era in which was, say, there had been a time of gods, a time of heroes in the past in the mythologies. Now it was just the time of man, and it had been noticed that nobody had been able to carry out what heroes or Christ at this point had done, definitely. And so the idea is that Christ maintained that this medium till the end of time had, at least in general attitude, given more hope also to anyone, to the humble, not in just a rigidly kind of elitistic fashion like in the past, which is what Christianity had criticized by basically opposing the most powerful entity in the world, so the empire, and managing to win over it, so proving God's superiority to any earthly dimension. And so essentially reconfirming this attitude. You need a collective effort to salvation, right? So you understand immediately that behind the Crusades and the idea of essentially not just reconquering the holy places, but re-extending the ecumenic control of such faith, right? So the most spiritual value, and technically, again, not the legalistic, state and border thing, but literally the idea that you cannot even, let's say, hope to be a universal power if you factually do not literally rule the entire universe, and even more, of course, the holy places of Christendom that at this point had fallen in the hands of the newly and kind of zealously and fanatically converted Seljuks, right, from paganism to Islam, because the newcomers are always the most eager, to show a degree of extremism to prove their fitness, their worthiness. And they also came, in fact, from that kind of more pagan, chivalric, warlike background, right? So that they would find points in common even with the Franks during the Crusades, as you know, and so on. Was basically the standard awareness. This was not exoteric knowledge. This was not kind of some sort of thing that just somebody knew, but it was literally the entire point why religion existed, politics existed, churches existed. The entire art of the time was dominated by this, not by some kind of strange bigotry or dogmatism or cultural backwardness or whatever, because this thing had always existed, right, since ever, throughout all paganism, throughout all Christianity, that, as I countlessly explained, are literally the same identical religion, if people were willing, again, to come out of the, in fact, post-traditional, modernistic, and categoristic, positivistic, and man-based, so doomed to fail, conclusions that you have been, at least assumptions say better, that you have basically learned from history books as they are at least printed today, unfortunately, with that type of content. And if you have this view, you can much more quickly understand also where the Crusades came from. Because again, if you miss this background, you would think, again, This thing did not exist before. They started, again, as I said before, doing it from the late 11th century, out of the blue. No. And what you see, and somehow you say, maybe you study, now we will quote some of these works that explain theologically the theory of this, the practice of this. It may seem primitive in the sense that, look, these were strange ideas that were trying to put together the word not intelligent as us. You have to consider these people were basically repeating what was already common knowledge at the time. So they didn't need to insist too much on it. Yes, in a civilizational sense now, by the 11th century you have really, feudal monarchies, you have, in fact, a papal monarchy also in the first place, you have a general alliance between these forces, so of course you need some kind of more advanced theological capacity, juridical ones, and so on. So this all happens. How many times we've talked about common law, civil law, canon law during the 11th century. It's a fundamental concept, right? And if you, for example, miss, what's the idea of justice in those laws, like how can you even, for example, because this is the attitude mostly gets down which most historiography gets down to, the idea that just war now was just beginning to be toyed with at this point. It had always existed. It's not a mystery, right? The entire world was held, even just by the non-written kind of oral legacy, if about common law, on the basis of justice, right? Common law had justice. Civil law, Roman law that had also began as common law, has justice. Canon law has justice. This is how literally the communities of the time live by, right? Because these weren't abstractions created and imposed on people, that these things emanated from the same communities. Also quite preromptant way that was, this time banally, I don't know, that the peasantry had way more power than it would have, say, during the Renaissance, right? But you have also been told that at this point, just the peasants were a bunch of sheep that lived in paranoia and obscurity and ignorance. See what peasants did, also quite in a brutally violent way, even against powerful actors like lords and bishops and whatever. So this this view doesn't help anyone, right? You have to probably, if this is the background from which you come, you have to rewind everything and start from zero, because I understand that it's pretty relatable. We've also been growing with those ideas, but they are substantially wrong. I mean, this is not even a mystery for the people who actually study it today. One wonders why they keep repeating the simplified version of this that leads everyone astray, because it simply doesn't say what the actual belief was. And again, I could explain to you in 20 minutes. I know that my introductions are somehow ranty and whatever, but the question is, if you don't say this, how can you get the rest? For example, Guibert of Nogent wrote that God had created a new means to salvation, the holy battles, the Praelia Sacra, right? So it is true that in 11th, 12th century historiography, and literature, broadly meant, you do have a sense that there is an awakening, that there is something new. Think about the De Laude Nove Militia by Bernard of Clairvaux, about the current times, right? Considering that militaristic ideas were all over the place, there was always this sense that the end of time was near, and which is always true, but they thought it was just like behind the corner, as it could be. Just the knowledge, the prophetical works, the kind of the theological side, were all bringing to a great discussion of how the thing would happen, because it was believed to be really a big deal. The Judgment's Day, and also lots of worse things that have to happen before that. Naturally, the fall of Jerusalem, the hands of the Muslims, was felt as, at least of the Seljuk Turks, that had also worsened a bit the situation, at least initially, seen as a major deal. Now, the interesting thing is that Christians kept traveling there. I think the Seljuks banned the Christian pilgrims for just a very few time, and then they restarted. And paradoxically, it's this Seljuk presence that reinforced even the means of pilgrimage, the organization. This was the military escorts of this. I mean, the Normans were deeply involved, for example, in this, and that's also why they, for example, decided to create a kingdom in southern Italy, because that was literally from the place from which pilgrims embarked from the west to the Holy Land, and so they would hire these northerners as private bodyguards. So there was and this all happened naturally with, I don't know, the Normans, serving as, in the Byzantine armies during the invasion of Muslim Sicily, mercenaries you could find on the Caspian Sea, or in the Byzantine army also in Armenia fighting against Alp-Arslan in the campaign of Manzikert. So people knew, generally speaking, that also the Western world was opening to a new dimension. And of course there was something redemptive about this transfiguration, because the ultimate goal was, okay, we are reacquiring power, we are resuming the initiative, we are loading ourselves morally further, thus we can achieve more, and also properly the world conquest, right? Again, these times in history came after centuries, almost half of a millennium of Islamic offensives. There was also a resentment, there was a sense of revanchism, there was a sense of retribution, in fact of justice, and we will not dwell here in the relation between the Christians and the Muslims. We will make other videos about this. What seems to have mostly changed in the way such feat could be achieved was not much, of course, the realization that the world could be conquered again through the example of a single man in a Christ-mimic fashion, but that this had to be carried out by arms. Yes, sure, the arm of the Spirit that also Jesus had used, and the Gospels are very violently worded, and people say, well, it's metaphorical. Well, it's not entirely metaphorical. There is nothing purely metaphorical, purely abstract, purely allegoric. There's always a quite and consistent awareness of how the world worked, like what were the respective spaces. Like there was a spiritual dimension you had to concentrate the most on, but you still lived in the world, and so you had to cope with the world yourself, but actively, right? So up to that point, I made multiple videos about, for example, penitence in early medieval Europe. So you realize that even in very brutal systems, you would think they wouldn't care anything about penitence, and they were also barely Christianized or something, that killing was seen as just not a big deal. Actually, if you study that throughout all Western Europe and beyond, you realize that people cared a big deal about killing people, in the form also of, in fact, of penitence, of redemption. You couldn't simply get away with that. Right, there were very empirical ways of determining that. So again, I can send you back to those videos. You can find in the Medieval Christianity playlist, penitence, something like that. Penitence, Schwerpunkt on YouTube should do. We will come back on that as well. And I made multiple stuff also about the Crusades, I think I created a playlist on Holy War, or at least I want to. So you can find everything in ever more kind of encyclopedical way now. As I was saying, there was now a new option that at least had not been stated out loud, especially by now what had profiled itself as a papal monarchy, regarding the fact that killing per se, so war in a dimension that naturally reflected a spiritual one on earth, could bring to salvation, and thus redeeming the world as such. Nobody, say, when we look at the indulgences thing, we're told, like, you have both your place in paradise. That was actually an hypocrisy, there is no doubt. But it was never fully believed to be so, because the people at the time understood that this could be at best an aid, right? You couldn't simply buy that, right? A poor person, a peasant, a superstitious chthonic element could still, in the broader understanding of this all, even believe that something could do, that it could be a little space in heaven, just like keeping to be a peasant, but at least living forever in heaven and not dissolving into hell that is technically a non-place. So the idea properly that your soul does not exist anymore, while only the transfigured ones could save themselves, can live forever in the one. Naturally, most people didn't arrive to this kind of theological, philosophical, even terms, but conceptually they were quite aware that this was the deal. I mean, if you attend a Christian mass, it's all stated pretty out loud clearly. Like, there is no certainty. We pray, we hope, we tend to in fact boost that collective, spiritual, ecclesiastical, ecumenic, Catholic dimension, exactly to show the unity that has to mimic God, and technically and hopefully with a universal power being able to rise to ascend to, like in a heavenly fashion. But nowhere is said that you actually have the certainty of saving yourself. So that may definitely belong to the ignorance of a miserable world, like all these pre-industrial ones really were, whatever. Not that we live in much better places in moral terms, but at least we can also rationalize certain aspects and so on. The point is, again, that the people of the 11th, 12th century lived in such a deeply ingrained way in the hierarchical order that for them, again, the most important thing was to still keep this going, in the sense that it was understood this hierarchy, this organism, was the same one that gave them to eat, right? And that allowed them not to be in a constant state of struggle, the homo homini lupus of obscene memory, let's say. And they attributed naturally, as it is done with the church, like a spiritual value, a metaphysical, transcendental value to it, right? So at least the idea that now, through holy war, that dimension of salvation could be closer, not quite just at hand, but still, of course, soaked in such a superior dimension that could consistently help to salvation, began to be stated more out loud. Right, up to that point, you see, I made a video just recently about the paradigm shift in late antique spirituality, which basically I said what I said before about Christianity regarding to the empire. Christianity reasserted the spiritual unity as essentially a reaction to the shortcoming of the secular authority of the empire that had been shrinking in the first place. And remember that in tradition, it's always your fault, right? Even if somebody fights against you and defeats you, like technically, in front of God, what matters is what you did, not what the other person did, right? Because if you don't absolutize that, you cannot hope to absolutize, in fact, a universal power as well. Because you should be able to tame, first of all, the guy who defeated you, but first of all, yourself. And you were not able to, right? So Christianity said, look, you failed at this. We believed in you by a degree. Also because Christianity, throughout most of its life up to that point, had been living in the empire in a quite cooperative way, right? It's known that Christians were well integrated through, in most of, at least the lower strata of society, also middle ones, but I mean, in the 2nd and 3rd century, persecutions were somehow rare. The empire was not, again, particularly concerned with this, nor was a threat or something that disintegrated kind of warlike values. There's not a single instance, for example, of any Christian saint, the military once having refused to fight because it was about killing people. There was not even one. What they didn't want was to sacrifice to something that they didn't believe was God. So the actually the earthly divinity of the emperors. They were all excellent military machines, and if you study throughout all kind of Byzantine history, I don't know, even in the darkest 7th century, we study, what an imperial Christian soldier was about. They had the same exact moral values of Achilles or Hercules, according to mythology, and very often the very same, in fact, awareness of this mythologically and in quite brutal ways. So Christianity had always been about warring, since a very early time. Of course, the absolutization of the spiritual dimension was a metaphor to say, again, it's not that the world does not exist. It's that, in theory, in order to achieve the deal, you should act as if this was not even there, right? Siddhartha Gautama, we have seen it in the video about the Vedic religion, was just a soldier. He was a warrior. He belonged to the warrior caste. Right, so the ones who literally believed that they were the ones that had to carry out the self-transfiguration, and in a time in which they recognized the system had sunk, had not fulfilled the promise of saving the entire world. And thus, what does he do? He was a soldier, a person who killed people by profession. He retreats to that, what people now today, 1968 leftistic way say, oh my god, man, it's just about peace and spirituality and whatever, and Buddha, it's the greatest, man. He was a person who was planning to conquer the world entire through the boosting, essentially, of a spiritual exercise. That was the one that ancient warriors used, again, to conquer the world, as they had conquered India and beyond. Right, so the entire point was still valid, right? And in early medieval times, in post, say, at least unitary empire in the West, it was the monastery that had mostly embodied that kind of model, right? Monastery etymologically comes from the Greek, from the monad, right? So it's the idea of coming back to the one, that every monastery has to be a heavenly Jerusalem, so the paradise itself. And that in an exemplary fashion, in a merely kind of inspiring spiritual way, and definitely not one that is severed from the world, if not spiritually, not physically, because the monks have to actually go around and being seen by the rest of humans for operating in the same way, with the actual purpose of making the entire world a monastery, to make the entire world a heavenly Jerusalem, to transfigure the entire universe. Right? That's the purpose of it all. And this sense of defeatism, the idea that the empire had failed, whatever, had brought to, as we said in that series video, like to an introversion, to an introspection, say what did go wrong within? Because that's how the world falls, right? It's the dimming of the awareness of the sacred in the heart of man. It's the sclerotization of the means of that. It's just the idolatry. It's just superstitious subordination. It's relativism. Is the lack of a center, of an order, of a hierarchy, right? Now, when, unsurprisingly, the Christians were retaking the initiative and re-expanding quite successfully, it was obvious that just for sheer practice, the military element would come back on the fore as actually a mean of, like, again, given that no achievement can exist if not by God's will. So in a way that the same soldiers at this point were recognizing, as they had always felt it by themselves, like being divinely inspired, driven, whatever. So there is the switch, there is this perception in the 11th century that the tides have turned, and thus the Ordo Equestris, the knights, or the order of knights, the military class that had substantially sedimented in Europe with great homogeneity also, as the milites, right, could and had to lead the struggle. This naturally was an ecumenic Catholic system, so the common people, the vulgus, could do this too, because again, the vulgus was under the milites, and there was a clientary society and an order and a hierarchy, so everybody was contributing to the system, right? The peasants work for maintaining the knight, the horse, his panoply, the lifetime training. The clergy has to to indoctrinate the knight, and has to be maintained as well for studying, praying, their world life, meditating, etc. So it's a collective effort towards this world reconquest practically. And this could not happen but through God's grace that had to be won in order to succeed. And this is clear also in all the Indo-European mythologies from ancestral times. It is that you technically can't become God yourself by returning to the One, but this cannot happen without God's grace, without an order that is somehow already present in nature, the Logos, right? The cause of all things that will smile upon you if you have the courage of rising to the standards of, right? And this, especially the military task, was properly seen as the response here, right? Even when there were naturally times of disappointment. The only true great success of the Crusades, at least in the Outremer, was the first one. I mean, the first one was really a very a miraculous event, right? You couldn't, if you look at the hardships, doesn't matter how good those troops really were. There was something heavenly about the first Crusade campaign and the crowning with Jerusalem's conquest, right? Then there were moments of abatement. The Second Crusade, it was a disaster. Yet still at that time, Otto Freising, writing his chronicle of the First Crusade, so we're talking about some half century later, the events, continued to believe fundamentally in such categories, because the universe in this sense never changes, right? You cannot say, well, we tried this because we invented it before the time of the First Crusade, and then the second says, we have to rethink it, because the world is always the same, it never ends, right? The concept that you have to reconquer everything existed since the dawn of civilization. There wasn't any, and this is also a very secular way of saying that, that actually had existed since the fall. With the possibility of humans, however, achieving that true civilization. And, of course, the West was confident at the time that they could do it again. Now, the problem is that we talked about this often in our Crusade history videos, was not entirely convinced, naturally, of the worthiness, not much of the cause in itself that was seen as, in fact, pretty rational terms as correct. You must reconquer the Holy Land. There is nothing bad about that. You should be doing that. But how many actually, for all the problems that you have home, right, where will you place that kind of spiritual standard? It was a generalized question, right? Because, again, it was up to every person, as we will see now. So the new kind of soldiery, the novum militia genus, had arisen, but not the difficulties, right, in achieving success had not fallen, just per se. There was a monastic ideal behind, in fact, the new soldier, right? From their behavior and way of life, you would have thought they were like more monks than soldiers. And in fact, the monastic military orders were born properly. They would, as you know, pioneer the Crusades politically, militarily, especially in the very places, while most of the rest of the militias would come back to Europe. Now, Otto Freising, that also talks about these things, is referring to the Templars, the oldest military order, for whom Bernard of Clairvaux had coined the expression nova militia, the new soldiery. Otto considers that such community had effectively come into existence with the First Crusade, in a time of political disorder. And as a German, he felt that more, because those had been the same years of struggle between father and son in the empire. In fact, the Emperor Henry IV had witnessed the rebellion of his son, Henry V, in a very delicate moment in the history also of Christendom, in investiture struggle, in the evident again difficulty that the empire had to probably remain standing right against an opposition that, while led by the papacy, was not anti-imperial per se, was just testing the empire, testing the capacity of, are you fit to be able to rule and convince even the papacy of this, and your subjects, without which, as we've seen, you cannot, without the control which you cannot even claim to be ruling anything, right? So this is not a very different justification, for example, than the one Augustus had given of the civil wars in his ideology. How could it be possible that the chosen people of God, and in this case probably the universal religion, had something like an internal break, right? Had broken properly the unity, right? The Catholic power, the entirety of the world. So what had to be achieved in the first place, without any exception, for the entire human existence even to have a sense anymore, right? You had to justify that, and Otto had basically stated that the new soldiery had been born as a sort of reaction, in fact, to what was happening in the empire, so namely a civil war for which the Templars in the Holy Land had decided to detach themselves from, right, and saying that's not our thing. Our entire task, our entire duty and life purpose is to defend Christ's honor in his name, and nothing else, right? I made videos about the Templars, the Hospitallers. We've seen how ascetic they were, in many ways, also coming from the world before, but having been partially, burdened by what, in fact, the earthly shortcomings had evidenced themselves like. And so setting, again, like the monks that they were, the example for the rest of the world to imitate them. And it's meaningful that they were knights, because the only possible example to imitate was Christ. And if you read the Bible, Christ is not simply, let's say, peaceful per se, right? Nor he is, the apostles are, right? And so that, of course, the greatest followers, even the same founder of the church, is one of the ones that commits some of the worst sins, including properly renegating God himself multiple times, actually using violence, making blood running, and so it was deeply, ingrained in the world at the time that, as I was saying at the beginning, no human existence could exist without suffering, without bloodshed, without sacrifice, and without the sacrifice of the flesh. That naturally is fundamental in the human nature, and the same passion of Christ had exemplified. The Merovingians, in their emetophilia, had been, so we're talking about peoples that were still literally doing human sacrifices on a regular basis with prisoners of war as Christians, right, from pagan practice, would be exalted with, that an 11th century Norman knight could easily identify himself with. The sacrifice of blood is everywhere, right, in all mythologies, and it has to do exactly with this. You cannot obtain anything if you do not sacrifice the greatest. What is greatest in your own life? Your willing conscience, awareness of sacrificing yourself in the name of God, because you will prove that, guided by that, you cannot be stopped. And if you do, it's because you are personally faulty. But it's the only way to salvation. Sitting there in a corner will not do it anyway. So at that point, what do you have to lose? right? It sounds a bit Pascalian if you want, but it is the real deal. And the church was pretty aware of this too, right? Again, they were the same world, the same society, the same people. There was not a divide between the clergy, the knights, especially in this case, if you understand it, not just bishops were pretty warlike, but the same monks had armed themselves. It's technically not clergy, but, still, they were all cooperating, never disconfessing each other as such. Just criticizing the people who, as humans, held the offices, but never the institution which was sacred. The empire was sacred, the church was sacred. And the Catholic unity was sacred as well. The only way to conquer the world. Any form of disgregation is weakness. It's cultural inferiority. It's essentially setting your standards to something that is ever lower. That's why I have it so much against nationalism and socialism, because there are people that, even from a conservative perspective, still think that that nationalism has anything to do with tradition, and they actually believe that. And it's not just an embarrassment for themselves, because, by the way, they don't realize that, but it's literally the world we live in. And then you wonder why things go wrong in the first place. Keep blaming others, not concentrate on yourself. At least I explained the thing. I don't hear anyone doing it. Right? And it's a struggle for everyone, because we're all a bit nationalist, we're all a bit socialist, we're all a bit something that is wrong, because we are a fallen kind, we are sinners by definition, and we the only way out of this is achieving the utmost that materially, you can say, given that science has, at least the one practiced, is materialistic mostly. But, spiritually, that is finite, but spiritually is infinite. That is to say, we literally do not know what happens to the greatest of spiritual possibilities, because basically we have not achieved that, or at least we have yet, or we haven't, we have properly stopped practicing the way, in fact, a warrior or a Templar or whoever, or the Buddha, as we make all these examples, would. And there are specific techniques, like these are not, just mere beliefs. They were entire lifetime practice connected with this and how to achieve that. And in those times, those were much closer and evident to anyone, also because lifestyle by itself forced you also to a degree of deprivations that was definitely just setting you a bit on that trend by itself. So in other words, the Crusade offered lay people their own way to salvation. It was partly a development which gave an assured place in the world from a religious point of view. About the middle of the century, Guerra of Reichsberg reduced this to a general formula, is to say people from all stations in life could find in the Holy Scripture a rule which would lead them to salvation. This also was clear, right? If he hadn't written that, everybody knew that. All the fathers of the church knew that. And in this case, what is meaningful, rather, is the fact that for the first time, some elements that had traditionally remained in the shadows were called to perform the sacrifice with the possibility of saving themselves. I mean, after years of quasi-feudalism, of widespread misery, of incredibly slow political and institutional development during the early Middle Ages, it's obvious that most people's lives was dramatically miserable, more miserable than it would be also in the 11th and 12th century already, still by our standards. And this, morally speaking, had been weighing a lot. I mean, just think about living in a world like that. When you leave, your life expectancy is ridiculous. You see people dying all over, young, children. The world is, again, poor, materially poor. If something goes wrong, a famine, a harvest that goes wasted, you starve to death. The terrible thing, wars. you don't even have properly an order. So you are automatically brought in your sinful human nature to stay under the superstition. The thing will happen, and you will lose the hope that you can change that. So that is essentially your own soul weakening itself and distancing itself from the one. Now, in a moment of revival, Western Christendom had refound this strength, this capacity, this force that was emerging even from the lower elements of society. Trades were expanding, cities developing, agriculture was ever more specializing. There was more force, more power. All this, again, was all one. It was not a class acting separately from another. It was the entire system to be growing by that scale, that the confidence that new things could be achieved now could be restated in a strong fashion. Of course, this could not happen but religiously, through the sacred scriptures, and through the action, right, upon the same faith, which is always an act of faith, because technically we don't even know what's going on, broadly speaking. So we always have to accept a sacrifice for every action we take. This is narrow psychology, right? It's not, and again, the Bible is that, right? So if you wonder whether, even we're talking about some strange, weird, anachronistic times in which people believe strange things, just because you don't actually know what they actually believed in, or what is written in the Bible, or why it's written, and how it was written, and why, right? You have properly not been trained. You've been actually even properly prevented from knowing that meaning. And we have been known in a civilization that meaning, not 1,000 years ago. We knew it 80 years ago. This had been surgically removed from most educational structures for essentially a Marxistic, that is properly a satanic purpose, because it's the denial of any spirituality, thus of pure materialism and superstition of the means of production of both people. And as essentially an inverted, sick, twisted world that aims at destroying any trace of mankind in the process. And so, of course, any culture, any education, any beauty, any intelligence, any human worth, right? Look at how people are treated and have been treated historically in communistic regimes, and look even at those where communism namely does not exist anymore, what kind of social disaster this has produced. It's unprecedented in the history of mankind, right? Nobody had seen this complete destruction ever historically, because historically tradition had remained. There hadn't been flippings of this like we have in complete destructions in practice of this. There we have a pretty macroscopic, self-evident reality, right? So, and this goes on and on and on, right? Still today, on billions of people. This is not like yesterday. Sometimes we live still in an era of savage, culturally underdeveloped, humanly abortive, communistic, socialistic regimes, and other regimes that fundamentally exalt them, right? Still in their memory, in their past. At the time, it would have been illegal to exist as a person if you believe these things. And that's the reason why, say, people were burned at stakes. And if you actually study what those people believed, they weren't, again, the heroes of free thinking in the Middle Ages. Were fanatic gnats that were dramatically more intolerant, bigoted, dogmatic, fundamentalistic than any other belief that existed within their own religion, which they entirely believed, by the way, themselves, and that had nothing to do with this strange, mockery and cognitive dissonance of the existence of something called free will, which is properly neurophysiologically unattainable by any living species, and that you've been told basically they were somehow mastering by opposing themselves to the terribly oppressive church and the evil popes and all this BS that you find. Make a search on YouTube and search, how many times in your search emerges a video like, which was the most evil pope? Like, which was the, most evil TV show present. It's all about the anti-Christian ideology, anti-papal, anti-Catholic. Catholic meant as universal, as imperial by definition. So this is not even to say that everything has its place. Everything has its time. There is a reason if things crumbled. Again, it's up to us. It's not up to, say, you can be simply Catholic and say, okay, well, I skipped this. Well, yes, there is some merit in that awareness, but this still doesn't, change the fact that religion is just collapsing in the world because people's standards are sinking to a subhuman standard that we cannot properly fix because we don't have the means now to we don't have the strength that we could easily have if we wanted to actually discipline these people, to give them an education which is an actual education, not what people are taught in schools, the educational standards of which are the lowest, I think, ever attained in practice, in absolute terms. And not because they are anti-Christian, but because they literally don't learn anything anymore. The entire concept of learning is dead. Right? New generations do not understand what it means. And not that, us a decade or more ago knew it that much better, but at least there was still a glimpse of that. We will have to take care of these people because they will become disabled mentally, physically. We will have to essentially maintain them parasitically to some degree because they will not be able to be anything like but slaves, practically. If you wonder why slavery existed historically, well, it was in part because of this, right? It's because these people had properly lost their own capacity to even elevate themselves to some standards. And generally speaking, in the past, it was all much tougher, right? So that normally, at least the people who were enslaved in the past were people that came from places where their sole purpose was to constantly enslave everything around them, right? And so they were paid with the same coin, ironically enough. So never keep quiet about this kind of leftistic mental disorders because they just reveal how underdeveloped the culture you come from actually is, and nothing else. I'm talking about parental background, first of all. So when we look at the 11th century, we realize that it didn't take any more. Like it had been recognized that being a monk, just per se, was not the only way, or was not just the preferential way. There were other means now, right? Nobody had the classed, let's say, monasticism. As such, naturally, we could digress endlessly on this in some other Christian history videos because, that, for example, bishops and monks didn't like each other at all for obvious reasons. Because to a degree of, say, hiding of the word, there is inherently, again, also the failure of not having been able to conquer the world. So the early Middle Ages, as we've seen, was also consequently the consequence of a collective failure. Right? If a person fail, you fail. Always remember that because you had the opportunity to make that person succeed and yourself succeed and beyond, and you didn't use that power. That can exist only if it is God-given and it can work in the world. Right? The idea also was that renouncing the world, and this was a beautiful, in fact, concept recovered in the 11th century, was just a Christian experience. I mean, at one's baptism, a Christian has already abjured the devil, right? So the path that you will eventually decide to take in your life to God is up to you. That's the liberty that God has given you. It's not freedom, because freedom means without being bound to anything. And so without discipline, without anything to owe anyone, if you are alive, you owe it to something that is greater than you, because we can't even explain what life is in the first place, and so that should immediately already make you wonder about that, and we are not amazed at life anymore. We consider it as a just as a commodity of some sort, right? And these ways could be infinite, right? There's not a standard one. There is actually, in everything that happens, a divine will was somehow already present in the universe, in a sort of determinism that, however, still entails actually free will at the same time. And of course, science mostly, there are lots of scientists who are pro free will, but the traditional concept is that what happens because it had already been decided, yes, but because you did it anyway, willingly. So it's both things at the same time. It's just Christ on the cross. He's dead but alive at the same time. It represents the duality of metaphysics, spiritual and material issues, and the fact that they're inextricably intertwined. Right? So you always have an element of divine power that derives from the fact that you're made in the image of God, from which you have fallen. But you still can't find your way back. And this is how they were thinking it at the time through the Crusades. Let's re-extend Christendom, let's represent our empire, and let's come closer to God through that, because it will have been His will. Equally, at defeat arose questions regarding the moral unfitness of those who had lost. Another word on the indulgence as such, because from one side, this, as we've seen, was connected to the Crusade specifically, so we tend to think of it as the Christian response to the oppression of the Holy Land, right? That the best way to term the Crusade, which is still an approximation, is the concept of armed pilgrimage, right? It's part of that kind of path, right? Customized personal path to God that you need to undertake. There were different forms of pilgrimage. The Crusade was properly a military one. The indulgence was connected with the idea that this wasn't given by the church or any kind of human power per se, but again, just as a sign of God's grace, right? And the grace does manifest itself by always some degree. It doesn't necessarily, however, mean that it's going to be to the fullest, right? Many people thought, okay, I've added something to my possibility of salvation and see what happens in the afterlife in the first place, but the existential anxiety about not making it and still hanging on someone to make it, of course the faith in Christ, because that's the medium that eventually would have had to come back and together with the church defeating Satan, that would have had to rule on the earth for a while before the end of time. And this had already, by the beginning of the second millennium, naturally become some kind of a more modern and secular view on the thing. That is to say, I can make this effort, the sacrifice. Going to a crusade was very risky in the first place. Aside from warfare in itself, such long journeys were very perilous and dangerous lands populated by sometimes Christian peoples. Like, they were more dangerous than the same Turks. The Bulgarians didn't have a great name in the process on the Balkan route. However, it was considered a big deal at the time, but not necessarily the ultimate deal. People didn't leave necessarily to go die there per se. Some would, right? And this is not just about the Crusade, where some Anglo-Saxon kings that in early medieval times they sound a bit all alike. They make testament. When they're old, they go to Rome, to the tombs of the apostles, and they die, right? So the idea of coming closer to the center of the world, coming closer to the holy places, and participating to this journey that was also the one of the triumph on yourself as much as the world in the process. That had to be absolute at some point in history now had become something milder comparatively, because again the absolute would be self-sacrifice in holy combat, and it's not even, it's yet to be seen that whether you succeed or not, because it may not be enough. Not all those who die in battle go to the Valhalla, right? At least there is a chance of that happening to a degree that can help to the final war, but at that point it doesn't depend much on themselves or on the way they have. It depends on the way they have died, but it's still far from the utmost standards in theory just God should attain in order to win on the world in the first place. So it's always way more distant by scale from what we have habituated ourselves to think kind of salvation like you're just good, you go to heaven, you wish it were so easy, right? There is a positive confidence in faith, in hope, but this must be translated into the actualization of the self, and not in just a mere wishful thinking. There it does become a superstition, and most religion is superstitious as a matter of fact, because of the people that profess it fall terribly short of the expectations, not because of religion in itself, that is, after all, the reason of the entire existence. In any case, this thing of the indulgence as a sign of God's grace is stressed, for example, by Bernard of Clairvaux in his crusading appeal, in his appreciation of course, of the new soldiery. You have to consider that the indulgence also came to be at some point like a sort of oblong to the church, has to do with the organizational capacities of the same thing. I mean, we are at this point in a time in which armies also are becoming ever more organized, supplied, and not for the action of the single individuals, but mostly for the power of an overlord that is able to finance the whole enterprise. So there must be a cooperative contribution, and the indulgence in itself has that kind of earthly value, but it's worthless if it's not spiritually backed, right? This is the same case with the sacraments. Say, I don't know, with confession, for example. You can be absolved, namely, as a formal ritual, but if you are not truly repented within, that sacrament is useless, right? This is the Catholic magisterium. It's just we give you that opportunity, but you're not going to necessarily just be purified completely, right? You just have to wish and to act for it, rather than just thinking it's just a mere formality, right? After the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187, Gregory VIII made a crusading appeal, the Audita Tremendi, in which he said that God was, putting Christians to the test to see if they were prepared to do penance and risk their lives for their brethren. As we said, any loss was seen as a shortcoming of Christians, and everything negative that occurs is, of course, people's fault. And in as much, a chance actually to solve the crisis and thus transfiguring yourself. I mean, as you know, according to the doctrine, of course, it think about the parable of the prodigal son. It's better to have sinned and to be redeemed than paradoxically having always been up to the standard. This is not quite the entire story, meaning that, of course, if you are to higher standards in the first place, yes, it's better than having sinned, right? But the the morals of the parable is that we cannot improve ourselves if we don't fall first. That is to say, the knowledge of what happened there and the effort required to rise up is overall a greater experience than just even having remained of higher standards. It will at some point, even in the parabola, as you know, also bring in to the brother to say, but why? And so being envious, having and sinning again for something so light, instead of rejoicing that the prodigal son had come back after having sinned, after having been thrown out of his father's house. So every moment of crisis is a chance for everyone to redeem themselves, and nobody is beyond redemption. As long as they're alive, this is the bitter realization of that. And redeeming oneself completely is, just by single standard, de facto impossible. Right? You always need God there. And it's at least, it is in theory even possible. Right? Not even Christianity technically says that you cannot redeem yourself by yourself. But in any case, this cannot happen unless it happens. Let's put it this better. Ipso facto, just because you entered in God's harmony. Right? And there is not like the two things separated from one another. Thus, it's always God's grace that makes it, but not necessarily as a superior entity, but as an entity that you have simply to match with, right? Naturally, with dramatic standards, but you must make that effort, right? It's being able to achieve a 50%. Then the chance of adding 1 is always the ultimate question. And that is expressed by our mathematical limit of the infinite. Interesting is also the recovery of a historical awareness through this. All Uranian religions had a linear idea of time. Again, you have been fooled into thinking that before those terrible Christians, everybody believed in the cyclicity of the world. False, right? The Chthonic, Pelasgian, Dionysian did that. The rulers of the world saw everything in an eschatological dimension, right? Because a cyclical view of the world is mere superstition, and it belonged to the concept of the fact you would be simply swallowed and regenerated from, also in different forms that would still, even there, preserve the concept. You would always essentially just be given some extra time and to become ever a lesser form if you had underperformed in your life, and with a possibility of salvation, but essentially being under forces that you could not control. Uranian religions, like the ones of the Empire, etc., had always stressed that instead you could simply do the whole thing in one, the whole jump from Earth to heaven in one shot, in one life. This is another thing. In any case, the God, let's say, God as Lord of history, right, offering the Crusaders in this acquired notion that the times had changed, right, the chance to earn salvation in a war that was authorized by him. Again, the concept was not new. You can think, this crusade is new. No, it's not. Right? Every single war had been done in the name of God, because without divine power, no human can do anything on the battlefields. The entire early Middle Ages are about, chronicles saying, and God was from the side of these guys, of this others, when they won a battle. The pagans were the same. And everything depended on the competition between the two sides, not just saying, okay, I will bet on that god, so it will make me win. No. You had to be up to a standard. It was only one god, of which the others were just an hypothesis, for which they could become ways through which you could customize the path to the one, but it's still the one. There's only one God of war, one God of heaven, and it's the same God of the Bible as the same God of the Crusades. So there is literally no room for anything outside of religion. The crusade must consist of repentance, penance, pilgrimage. So a Christomimesis. This would be expressed in a willingness to fight for the same Christ cause, and the Holy Land as such, right? So the earthly Jerusalem, and so the point of conjunction between heaven and earth, the great east, the side from which the sun rises, also from a western perspective, and more, there is more in tradition regarding Westerners and people coming from the West that go as far as the myth of Atlantis, but it's actually a much more articulated thing that we'll talk about on another occasion. Naturally, the Holy Land was seen as Christ's heritage for obvious reasons. The Crusader must offer his life for his oppressed brethren in the East. It's a self-sacrifice. It's a new, say, personal covenant, right? That at least has to reinforce the one that Christ has made for the whole world, from the Jews to the world entire. And as Christ, of course, himself has offered his own life for mankind. That's what you have to be able to attain. So at least dying in a holy war was seen as, if not, like people were not, as we were saying before, normally for human reasons, not wanting to go there to die, but that was actually the preferable way to do so. And it had a bit always been, right? The interest, the obsession, the great honor for every Miles, let's say, was to die in a great pitch battle. A rare one, but still worth saying, okay, it was that day, and will be remembered in this kind of concert, in this show, in this theater. So, next to all this, there was the development of another, say, theoretical reflection, that is to say, the one on just war. That was taking on in this aging world, of course, ever more secular and modern characters, that is to say, aside from religion, that we all know, is there kind of a practical deal we can make in a contractual sense from a political point of view? Like if I have to go to the Crusade, for example, this affects substantially the community where I live. So how do I negotiate with that and so on? And on a bigger scale, what is the relation, for example, with the Muslims? Right? There was a deep sense of justice, right? The Muslims had made an injustice to Christ that had to be avenged in the conquest of the holy places. So the definition of just war, there was a bit of legalism around, again, great juridical development at this point that had to cope with practical issues. Was still, however, the center of order, of justice, of kind of, as we've seen, of an absolute standard, right? Not of a morally relativistic one. And there was something constant about the crusading effort, if anything, because the Muslims always remained a threat to the holy places and even managed to reconquer them, right? So there was always a good reason for, at least ideologically fueled, the crusade. There were much more practical ones. Objectively, a Western conquest of the Levant would have basically restored essentially the Roman control, the imperial control on the entire Europe and the Mediterranean as such. The Silk Route, something that had already been seen in the past. This naturally was a grand scheme that escaped the interest, as we've seen, of the average crusading Milas that just wanted to go there, maybe fight some skirmish to have fought in the Crusade, and then coming back to Europe, never to return. And this is another topic because, as you understand, in fact, there wasn't such a thing like a truly universal empire. Even the Holy Roman Empire was essentially encompassing just a bunch of countries at the time. Even though still by the 11th, the 12th century, it was a more general idea of its true universality. We came to saw it like a kind of a national thing a bit later. At least there was a role of national peoples within the empire, but it's to the world that they would have had to aim, and the limitations were evident. Another aspect that I never will cease to stress enough is the actually positive relation that Crusaders had with the Jews, at least the leaders. Meaning what? That, as you know, we all know of the massacres of the Rhineland, the kind of anti-Jewish sentiment to spread especially in some areas of Europe, in parallel with the Crusade. This is an emotionalistic, populistic response to the fact that, of course, if the enemies of the faith prevent Christianity to expand, why should we have non-Christians in our lands? Naturally, the Jews had a very specific role because they had to. They were, of course, blamed for the death of Christ, but they were also spared from forced conversion or wars because they had, first of all, historically cohabited and of course the main deal being the common scriptures, right? But so something the closest to Christianity, spiritually wise, in the roots of their culture. However, also the fact that they had basically always behaved and there had never been like a Jewish problem in the world. And the elites, the lay and the ecclesiastical ones, were always extremely protective towards the acts of anti-Jewish violence that mostly occurred in places that, in communities that didn't even have any particular kind of crusading fervor, except the excuse of now robbing the Jews of their property, etc. And on this occasion, the lay and the ecclesiastical authority saved an extraordinary amount of Jews, also repressing violently all these other motherfuckers that were trying to kill them and rob them. If anything, maybe they had also not a particular sympathy toward the Jews, because this was the grim reality actually up to very few centuries ago for the more rigid traditional beliefs regarding these people were at least hopefully to convert in the end, to witnessing the second coming of Christ, because that's what they were maintained as Jews, as witnesses outside just the church, right, to prove the world of the righteousness of the New Testament. But killing people like for this reason were just essentially consequence of disorder in the first place. The world was becoming ever more tumultuous, richer. The Jews at some point, as we've seen, had been properly entrusted by at least some of them, a minority telling the truth, with this capacity to handle money, which at least at some point was illegal because at least of the extra profits that eventually also medieval Christianity. So it was the idea is that the interest would be a sort of satanic magic trick where there was no actual absolute value in that wealth. Then by the late Middle Ages, Christian banks were, as you know, everywhere. They had surpassed the thing by saying that the interest would be just a cover for the costs of the money management. Thus, the Church was actually very critical of any anti-Jewish violence. This is expressed by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux during the excesses the violence occurred during the Second Crusade. the Jews were not bothering anyone. This was recognized by the ecclesiastical authorities. We can't think of the Middle Ages in a modern sense. There was properly the concept of modern tolerance as it develops in the West from, say, the second half of the 17th century especially, albeit based on some traditional ideas, was unknown at this time. Like the coexistence of communities was just a matter of convenience, right? And not much of a philanthropy, broadly meant. And as we've said, the Bible says that the Jews would be converted before the last judgment. So surely the Jews were committing a crime, living essentially a miserable life by disdaining the biblical truths, Christianly speaking, at least. Thus, it was enough for them to be Jews. That was the idea, right? So surely not a positive outlook overall. However, nothing that was in medieval times to justify a violence against them. Bernard sought to guide the Crusaders' zeal for God into sensible channels, right? So persecuting the Jews surely wasn't one of them, and it was also pretty dumb and atrocious. Unfortunately, however, such consideration were not enough to spare many Jewish communities from violence at the time as well. It's just the medieval picture was somehow less, let's say, oppressive than we think. So the idea of just war in this regard gained war mostly after the First Crusade, when properly also an Outremer states had been founded, so there was a broader international situation which the Franks had to cope with, also by times aligning themselves with the Muslims and thus having to compromise with some standards. It had been a big deal, as we've seen, to have managed to conquer the Levant in the first place, and maintaining it required very refined politics, quite delicate balance. In spite of the great potential that especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem had, which is often overlooked, the thing would fail, as you know, but we've seen in the many battle videos about the Crusades how much effort this history was studied. Now, let's say Bernard of Clairvaux again points out expressly in the epistle on the Crusades that force must be repelled by force. So that was first of all a just war. The heathens had basically struck back, and this had to stop. That force must be repelled by force is, I think, a self-evident act. It's just part of our genetic code. The entire evolution works on that base. Conflict is at the root of development in the first place, so it's always a test again. And it's entirely justified to respond with violence to violence. And some scholar says this is a juristic concept, right? He's prescribing, just saying that force must be repelled by force. There is no religion here. The question is, why should there have been? First of all, we're talking about Bernard of Clairvaux, so not just the last anti-religious or a religious person, of all. He's a guy whose entire work is the moment of highest holy war ideology in medieval literature. And this guy says something as banal as saying that force must be repelled by force within that religious context. What does this have to do with any kind of lay undertone to that? Right? This is obviously meant in a broader metaphysical, spiritual, religious, theological sense. It cannot be understood otherwise. Justice itself was founded on the base of a natural, so a divine law in all the juridical systems of the time. So whoever believes or makes this points out this thing, doesn't sound like a very competent scholar in this field in the first place, but they do exist, because I'm also reading from it, telling the truth. So I will not make names, because otherwise it seems like I want to insult these people, but they know who they are, of course. So there is also a lot of propaganda sometimes, where in order to boost the Christian morale, there was a lot of stories of the atrocities of the laments of the Christians in the Holy Land, and in part they were true, meaning at least that nobody really liked each other, not even like the local Christians with the Western ones. There was the entire problem of the Byzantines, of the reconquest of the Near East that had formerly belonged to the Roman Empire, so there was always an attrition. There were, again, alliances with the Muslims from both sides, and all these issues we will see in other videos, but they're pretty famous, as you know. In any case, the idea of an appeal for help and a call for punishment and revenge was pretty much out there, without any doubt. Nobody also in the West ever said that Crusades were not just wars, right? At some point, especially later on in the 13th to the 14th century, they began to say, but maybe the Muslims even have some right to those lands. But generally speaking, this is a modern and secular thought, in the sense that, why should there even be someone different, or that has some hardcore different beliefs that can't be solved by the truth that is one? Right, so traditionally speaking, it's a step backwards and the one of the decline of the world. In any case, again, there was a general homogeneity. Yes, reconquering the Holy Land until very recent in time was a thing that still today arguably has a value, even after the Crusades of the modern age, the British conquest, the foundation of State of Israel. Obviously, everything revolves still in a deeper sense that we tend just to neglect. Come on vacation in Israel, look, there are beaches and clubs, and then, yeah, maybe there is something religious too, but let's just, fuel the fact that, the average tourist in the world is just a radically underschooled ignorant who doesn't even know what happened there, and that doesn't give a damn about religion anymore. Well, unfortunately, we do live in this world, but history is always a gateway to that kind of higher awareness, and such places are always important. What affected, arguably the most, the world in the West at that time, regarding the idea of just war, was not much about the crusade in itself, but how the crusading concepts could be transposed at home. That is to say, in the baronial feuds in Europe that were definitely not counted as just wars, at least in this broader, theoretical production of the time. Also because by that point the feudal monarchies, with their peacekeeping purposes, were taking over. Naturally, from an individual point of view, like a baronial feud could be about something also very important. We made videos. I created a series about entitled Medieval Violence that looks at these clashes locally in many parts of Europe and say, what were they stemming from? And they were obviously stemming from important issues. Just in the bigger picture, they were destabilizing factors that were better over, right? And feudal monarchies were, generally speaking, growing because the majority of the subjects, barons included, understood that that was kind of the best way, right? So what emanated from the Crusades ideology was also an attention to, if you want, the different degrees of legitimacy in warfare. The idea that there were some things that were better than the others, and this is also, again, a bit of a modern thinking about the categorism. Idea there are different levels. Again, everything is different, so you can't quite categorize that. But there were some causes that were seen less worthy than before, right? It's just how we increase with civilized to disarm to, I'm pretty impressed when I see that there are people who think that, I don't know, still judicial duel is supposedly a mean of justice, right? Civilization made a progress to achieve more, right? If you want to solve matters with judicial duels, go back living in stinky huts in unstable tribes where you have to recur to that just because you're too desperate not to have a central authority. The rest is aestheticistic and narcissistic bullshit to claim that you have some kind of higher level of manhood because you're willing to just fight someone with a sword over a gun. To which sense? To which logic? To which reason? With which example? With which intelligence? Right? If you want to test your strengths, you can't do it with everything. You don't have to do it with this kind of pseudo traditionalism that has nothing to do with actual tradition, with the living blood, which is a completely different thing. Again, regression of civilization for 4 test agers, most that are pretending to act as something that they can't even know what it is anymore. But anyway, of course, the idea, again, mostly was revolving around monarchic power, but the idea that certain regional areas of Europe had to be stabilized politically to the point of not causing problems, further wars, and so on. So, pretty sensible idea from which most countries in Europe basically stem from, also territorially, politically speaking, nowadays. And that were successful, evidently different from the various baronies that nobody really remembers anymore, for a reason. There was in tradition, as much as in Christianity, of course, a idea of the sacredness of the royal office. I made a video about that in Barbarossa's times, for example. The office of our Majesty has been entrusted to us by God. That's how the Holy Roman Emperor would sign himself in the 12th century. Then it resulted in investiture struggle because naturally we're, soaked into Roman law as it was revived from Bologna for the sake of Barbarossa's imperial policy against the papacy and etc. All right, we all know that, but this naturally applied a bit to every power. Just now, kingdoms had basically now formed as the most common type of regional power out there, and the fact also empires were somehow like still a cluster of kingdoms, and such royal dignity was felt quite highly in general. The regnum, right, was slightly different from the imperium indeed, but it also in the Latin etymology and so on, but they were similar. Regnum was somehow preferred now, so there was a biblical analogy, but still it's the concept of a reign, right? It's how we use it in English nowadays. Like if you talk about an emperor, we say, well, his reign lasted. We don't say his empire lasted. I mean, we could say that. It's not wrong either, but normally, right? You talk about reigning, not... There's not even a verb, impairing or whatever, that is meaningful. It does stem from this tradition, because in Latin, actually there is imperare as a verb, Guibert of Nogent actually does look at the past historicistically and says that in antiquity, wars had been characterized by just a sort of lust for domination. So something sensualistic, emotionalistic, right? There had, however, been some wars that were fought to defend the freedom and the res publica against especially heathen enemies, because the reason in terms of the empire is Constantine rather than Augustus. So it's naturally a very blind idea, because how do you defend your res publica if you don't actually expand yourself too, right? How can this thing self-preserve? In any case, apart from these, Guibert said that in his own time, only the wars to protect the church were justifiable, right? And the church is the entire Christendom. So this is still a universal value, right? How do you defend Christendom if you don't kind of also keep it under control, right? And also expand it as long as people convert to it in the first place. Guibert, however, most importantly, fits the Crusades into such context, so that he basically goes in full circle by admitting that re-expanding, at least de facto the imperial control of Christendom is one of the aims properly of everything, since Christianity can exist in places that just are already Christian from quite a while, even before than Europe actually historically, but that can be many, right? It can be fundamentally even beyond. It can expand in various other areas, and you will at that point be obliged to reconquer, at least to defend, to get rid of the heathen that threaten it. Now this thing is interesting because naturally Christendom would expand during the Middle Ages further. It was already doing it by some degree at this point in other areas of Europe, so you can argue that yes, the Holy Land was the most important place, but in general, in the Baltic, in areas that also were not necessarily just Christian historically, or even that they weren't of the same confession. There was the problem of the schism, whatever, right? Required some sort of intervention, right? At least the idea of just war could be made always that kind of, reinvigorating by stressing which the degree by which you would take in consideration the absolute for still conquering all the rest of the world. The problem that these authors had in mind was mostly the fact that essentially killing was involved in this too, right? Today we don't talk about it because I made a video recently on that, refining the Holy War, things like that. Also the use that the papacy made of some, for example, the Norman mercenaries, and how some further, how they could be employed militarily speaking by ecclesiastical order, which was a huge deal, because in that case they would become vassals of the church, and the church couldn't quite put to death people, because it was in fact truly desecrating, given it was a mortal sin. But people could, say laymen could do that in defending the church, and that's why they were entrusted with the imperium also by a degree, because somebody must do that in the first place. So that there are very interesting implications. We're not fully, at least I'm not aware of a particularly developed philosophy on say crusading theology, because I mean crusading theory regarding to this matters in imperial fashion. with reference to the traditional understanding of war, but I presume we have to get there at some point as well. I will document myself, by the way, on it along the way. What is also obvious is that the idea of justice was underlying the idea of a just war, right? So nobody was denying the existence of a justice as much as the existence of a truth that pre-existed all these theories, because it was already present in all the science and the morals of the time. What was meaningful was that the just war was more, let's say, was holier than the others. Right? No war was ever devoid of some degree of holiness. And there is a huge debate again regarding what the average Miles would think of that, because there was always a reason, and the same Christendom had, as we've seen, emerged with the awareness that everyone had to be given the chance to, say, Christianity allowed freedom of conscience, as opposed to, other times in history. At least, from a legalistic point of view, which also justice fit, right? In any case, this was exploited instead mostly by justifying, again, the most important order makers, so kings, as we said before, ruling out a bit the baronial feuds that were seen mostly fought out of self-interests and not much else. Royal wars tended not to be morally condemned anymore, more than much, at least they were seen as noble enough on the base of also some kind of Christomimesis, right? These were not yet the years in which the concept of crown was properly created in an hypostatic sense, but there had already been some kind of attempt to naturally bring the kings above, right, to a condition that was not just the one of primus inter pares, but something a bit more hierarchically stabilized. So this is mostly the fulcrum on which crusading ideology was based for. Surely the First Crusade, the 12th century, and the entire idea of indulgence depended on the willingness to enter into the service of God yourself. Will, conviction, determination were crucial because mostly the Crusades were a voluntary phenomenon, right? So there were naturally much more concrete reasons why you would also participate to a crusade, but none of them could really be separated gnostically from the fact that they were seen as holy wars. So the mentality of the time is crucial, right? It's also distinguishing, as modern authors do, about the idea that the crusade was somehow more important than the political aim of the war. That doesn't make much sense, right? Because the crusade could have not been anything else but what it was also politically, right? And this idea of separating religion from politics is unfortunately one of the diseases that has ruined our entire historical understanding, first of all, but probably the same historiographical production. Right? How can you do something like that? Politically speaking, yes, you can say that baronial feuds are wars, but how is not a crusade political? Or why isn't anything political? It's pretty strange. War is an act of violence, but it's also a political act, always. So you can't have just a holy war. It's not politics, man. It's just religion. And so that you can blame better, or not blame better, whoever you want at convenience. Because you say, what's worse, politics or religion? Or why don't you understand that they are all one? And that you should make, first of all, an effort to understand. So surely there were other services at this point, at the service of the church, that were including pilgrimage in general, also in a, let's say, civilian context. It's not entirely separated from the rest of also the military dimension. So again, not even the Crusade or the Holy War as such should be seen as such a innovative concept. It had always been there. Everybody understood the concept of it. There hadn't been really any exception to this belief that I'm aware of at any other time in the past. And so I think the historiography in the Crusades should respond a bit more clearly without making strange analogies or trying to separate the two things, right, on base of modernistic or secularistic analogies. I really don't accept this, as a matter of fact. So there was no perversion of the traditional meaning. There was no alteration also of the crusading ideal as far as these other auxiliary activities were concerned. And the crusading ideology, as you know, was to remain alive until pretty recently in time, for the same reason that, again, it was understood clearly that unity makes political strength, and that nothing but good can come from that, right? And the ecumenicity, the Catholic nature of the church, was naturally aimed at seeking spiritual advantages, not in an individualistic, utilitaristic way for the individual, but for the entire church, for the entire Christian community, right? So we will talk about this because there are crusades outside the Holy Land. There are many other instances of, let's say, of holy war in other cultures. They're basically all the same. They revolve around the same exact traditional concept. Now we will do this hopefully at some other point. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I, as always, thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.